The annual Flaxborough Garden Fete had always been regarded as a triumph of civility over excitement. Each year the same competitions unfolded with the same measured enthusiasm: Victoria Sponge versus Madeira, begonias versus petunias, and the vicar's sermonette against the growing hum of gossip. Beneath the bunting and brass band, the town's worthies paraded a quiet pride in their horticultural and moral order. This year, however, it was the dahlias that would put a decisive end to both. Mrs. Edna Copley, a woman whose husband's municipal influence extended to nearly everything but her own conversation, stood beside the flower tent clutching her entry, a bloom so extravagantly purple it seemed to smirk at the pastel modesty of its neighbours. She had, by all accounts, spent more time on its cultivation than on her late husband's tomb, a fact not unnoticed by Mrs. Harbottle, who chaired the Women's Guild and lived to notice such things. "Splendid colour," murmured Mrs. Harbottle with a pursed smile. "A pity it lacks subtlety." Mrs. Copley returned the compliment with equal warmth. "One mustn't confuse subtlety with disappointment, dear." Nearby, a slow procession of townsfolk moved along the tables, each pretending to admire the floral exhibits while conducting an invisible inventory of social slights. Councillor Biggins had entered a tomato that looked suspiciously store-bought. Miss Feeney, the retired librarian, had knitted a tea cosy shaped like a hedgehog, and somewhere in the mêlée the brass band faltered into a key that suggested both heat-stroke and resentment. It was not until the judging that unease began to bloom. The judges, Colonel Fothergill, Mrs. Harbottle, and Reverend Copping, gathered around the floral table with clipboards and an air of ecclesiastical gravity. When Mrs. Harbottle stooped to inspect Mrs. Copley's dahlia, she emitted a short, startled sound, a cross between a cough and a reprimand. "Colonel," she said crisply, "I believe we have a problem." The Colonel peered down. "Good Lord," he muttered. "That's not mildew, is it?" It was not. From the stem of the magnificent bloom protruded the tiny, unmistakable glint of a hypodermic needle. By the time the brass band had stumbled into Jerusalem, word had already outpaced sense. Within minutes, whispers suggested that Mrs. Copley had murdered her gardener, her late husband, or possibly both, that the needle contained poison, narcotics, or something unspeakably French, and that the Fête Committee had decided to disband before tea. Inspector Purbright, who had been enjoying the comparative anonymity of the coconut shy, arrived with Sergeant Love, whose optimism was only rivalled by his inexperience, just as Mrs. Copley was being encouraged to sit down by two well-meaning parish ladies and a small dog. "It's nothing," Mrs. Copley said faintly, "probably part of the steak. Mr. Briggs helped me set it up." Perbrite regarded the flower, the judges, and the gathering crowd with the kind of patience that could have been mistaken for disinterest. "A curious place for a steak," he observed mildly. "And Mr. Briggs is?" "My gardener," said Mrs. Copley. "He's gone home. I didn't like crowds." Said Perbrite, as if that explained everything. He instructed Love to fetch the constable on duty and have the tent roped off, though gently, "We don't want to bruise the begonias." He then turned back to Mrs. Copley. "You mentioned Mr. Briggs. Does he live far, in the cottages by the railway?" she replied, "though he keeps himself to himself." A small commotion arose near the lemonade store, a boy shouting that someone was lying behind the storage shed. When Perbrite and Love followed the sound, they found Mr. Briggs face down among the grass clippings, one hand still curled as if reaching for his hat. He had the look of a man who had stopped working only because death had insisted. Perbrite crouched, observing the body without touching it. "No struggle," he said softly, "and not much of a scene." Love, who had gone pale, asked, "Do you think it's connected, sir?" Perbrite straightened, brushing a blade of grass from his cuff. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, everything is connected, usually by committee." Back at the Fête, the band had halted entirely, and Mrs. Harbottle was engaged in explaining to anyone who would listen that she had always suspected something peculiar about Mr. Briggs. Mrs. Copley, meanwhile, sat trembling beside her accused Dahlia, the very picture of injured innocence, or a rather good imitation of it. Perbrite allowed himself a glance at the clouding afternoon sky. A wasp circled the abandoned jam tarts, and the bunting fluttered as though in embarrassed apology. The Fête, like all good Flaxborough events, was ending not with a bang, but with a sigh. He turned to Love. "We'll have a word with the doctor, then pay a visit to Mr. Briggs's cottage. Quietly, please. Let's not disturb the flowers any more than we have to." As they walked away, the brass band resumed, valiantly playing out of tune. The melody carried thinly across the green, over the silent tent, and into the gathering evening, a tune that seemed, to Purbright at least, a touch premature for celebration. The lane to the railway cottages wound past allotments that looked weary from competition day neglect. Paper cups and bunting fragments fluttered along the hedges, the residue of civic pride now slightly sour in the evening air. Perbrite and Sergeant Love walked side by side, their footsteps steady and unhurried, like two men returning to an unfinished thought rather than a scene of death. The first of the cottages was dark, curtains drawn, but from the second came the thin scent of paraffin and chrysanthemums. Perbrite paused, noting the small signs of a solitary life: a pair of mud-caked boots left neatly by the door, a bicycle with one rusted pedal, and a half-eaten sandwich resting on a windowsill, as though its owner had been called away. "Mid-all, bite." Love cleared his throat. "Mr. Briggs lived alone, didn't he, sir?" "So it appears. Though solitude is not necessarily the same as privacy," Perbrite said, and pushed open the unlatched door. The cottage interior was a study in functional clutter: gardening books with torn jackets, a wireless with its cloth speaker cover askew, and a stack of empty seed packets arranged by brand rather than plant. A kettle sat cooling on the stove beside a single teacup that bore a faint ring of lipstick. Perbrite's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Friend," he murmured. Love followed his gaze. "Or a neighbourly visitor, possibly, though one does not often borrow sugar with rouge on one's mouth." He moved toward the small table near the window where a ledger lay open. Inside, written in a tidy but cramped hand, were notes of plant orders, delivery addresses, and a few lines that seemed less horticultural than personal. "Thursday. Collect parcel from chemist. Don't forget to return the syringe." Purbright closed the book gently, then inspected the small dresser. On the top shelf stood a framed photograph of a much younger Briggs beside a woman whose expression was both proud and uncertain. The inspector noted that the frame had been recently dusted, unlike everything else in the room. "Seems fond of his mother, sir," said Love, attempting helpfulness. "I rather think she predeceased the wallpaper," Perbrite replied. "This looks more recent." They found no other rooms worth searching, only a cramped bedroom where the bedspread had been pulled tight enough to suggest habitual discipline. Yet even here there was an incongruous touch, a bottle of women's perfume half hidden behind a shaving mug. Love picked it up, sniffed, and promptly sneezed. "Lilac," he said nasally. Perbrite smiled faintly. "Indeed, a scent that promises refinement but rarely delivers." They stepped outside again as the dusk gathered its greys. Across the field, the faint echo of the Fête still lingered, a few straggling children chasing balloons, the clatter of folding chairs. Flaxborough, to any outsider, looked serenely content. The doctor's car approached, headlights bouncing over the ruts. Dr. Hillingdon, lean and perpetually exasperated, climbed out with his bag and a look that suggested he had been interrupted during something less tedious than a death. Briggs, you say? Heart, stroke, or self-inflicted boredom? None confirmed, Perbrite said, but we'd be grateful for your thoughts. 10 minutes later, after kneeling briefly in the grass beside the gardener, the doctor straightened with a grunt. No sign of violence, no bruises, no wounds. Might have been poison, hard to say till the post-mortem. Pupils are a bit constricted. Could be morphia or something like it. Ah, Perbrite said quietly, as if confirming a suspicion he had borrowed from someone else. And the needle found in Mrs. Copley's dahlia? Needle? Hillingdon frowned. Good Lord, people do make gardening dangerous. Could be the same. I'll take him in for an examination. When the doctor had gone, Love exhaled a cloud of unease. Do you think Mrs. Copley had anything to do with it, sir? I mean, putting that in the flower? Purbright considered this as they walked back toward the main road. She had motive enough if Mr. Briggs knew something about her late husband's finances or her gardener's hours of service, but motive and opportunity are rarely found in the same garden. They reached the edge of the Fête ground, now half dismantled under the orange street lamps. A few volunteers were stacking chairs, and Mrs. Harbottle stood issuing instructions to the air, which seemed no less compliant than her subordinates. Inspector Perbrite, she said, turning with a smile of brittle virtue. I thought you'd have finished by now. We like to let facts cool before serving them, Perbrite replied. Tell me, Mrs. Harbottle, did you see Mr. Briggs much during the day? I hardly look at hired men, she said primly, though I do recall he brought Mrs. Copley's entry in that wooden crate. Handled it like a baby, he did. Ah, said Perbrite, and the crate where it is now? Behind the tent, I suppose? They were clearing it all away when I last looked. Perbrite thanked her, and he and Love made their way to the rear of the deserted marquee. There, half hidden among discarded boxes, was a shallow wooden crate lined with damp newspaper. On one sheet, barely visible under a smudge of soil, was a small printed advertisement circled in pencil. Discreet medical supplies for home use, confidential packaging, right to P.O. Box 37. Love whistled softly. Could be where the syringe came from. Possibly, Perbrite said, folding the paper. Or perhaps where something else was meant to arrive. The inspector stood for a moment, gazing over the darkened green where the bunting drooped like exhausted laughter. He felt that familiar tremor of curiosity that often came at the beginning of a case, the faint sense that somewhere in the gentle muddle of Flaxborough someone had tried to be clever. He slipped the folded newspaper into his coat pocket. Sergeant, tomorrow we'll have a word with the chemist, the postmaster, and perhaps Mrs. Copley again. But for now, let's allow Flaxborough to sleep. Deception, like most plants, thrives best in quiet soil. Love grinned uncertainly. Yes, sir. You think this is murder, then? Purbright looked out toward the black line of the river and the glimmering lamps beyond. I think, love, that someone has gone to great trouble to make a death look as unremarkable as possible. And in this town that's the most suspicious thing of all. Morning came to Flaxborough with the faint smell of overripe roses and civic embarrassment. The local newspaper, the Flaxborough Citizen, had already gone to print with a jubilant headline about the triumphant Garden Fete, blissfully unaware that the chief gardener was now awaiting post-mortem in the mortuary. Inspector Perbrite read it over his breakfast eggs with an expression of tolerant amusement, folding the paper as one might fold an inconvenient sermon. By 9 o'clock he and Sergeant Love were walking down the high street toward the chemist's. The shop, a long, narrow room smelling of camphor and floor polish, was ruled by Mr. Tegg, a man whose spectacles magnified his caution. His manner suggested that he sold nothing stronger than honesty, and even that sparingly. Purbright introduced himself with a mild nod. "We're looking into a small matter concerning one of your customers, Mr. Briggs, the gardener from the railway cottages." "You may have known him?" Tegg pursed his lips. "Briggs?" "Yes, sir. Regular in his purchases. Weed killer, liniment, aspirin, one of those practical types, not what you'd call talkative." "Did he ever order anything by post through you?" Perbrite asked, idly studying the glass counter lined with neat boxes of plasters and pills. "By post? Not to my recollection. Though he did ask once about obtaining medical syringes, said he was feeding orchids. I told him such things require prescription these days, even the small ones. He seemed put out, but not unduly. Love, whose notebook tended to record more than he was later able to decipher, looked up. Did anyone else ever make a similar inquiry? Around the same time? The chemist rubbed his temple, as if coaxing a memory. "Now you mention it, yes. Mrs. Copley came in about a week later, asking for something to inject plant food. Said her gardener had mentioned it. I told her the same thing, that such equipment isn't for amateur hands." Perbrite inclined his head politely. "Did she leave a name or address?" "Didn't need to, sir. Everyone knows Mrs. Copley." "Quiet." Perbrite's tone implied both agreement and diagnosis. "Thank you, Mr. Tegg. If anything further comes to mind, an odd purchase, perhaps a parcel collected on Mr. Briggs's behalf, do let us know." Outside, the inspector and his sergeant walked slowly toward the post office. Love frowned. "Seems like they were both after the same thing, sir." "Indeed, which makes one wonder who actually obtained it." The post office occupied a corner of the square, its windows filled with notices about lost cats and savings certificates. Behind the counter sat Miss Edith Rowley, who possessed that unassailable air of modest omniscience peculiar to women entrusted with the town's correspondence. When Perbrite mentioned Mr. Briggs's name, she blinked once and said, "He had a small postbox arrangement, one of those anonymous numbers for private orders. I collected a parcel 3 days ago, small brown paper, an ordinary handwriting. Was the sender a company? Couldn't say, Inspector. We're not supposed to read addresses beyond what's necessary, but I do recall the faintest whiff of something medicinal. Ether, maybe. I noticed such things." "Very conscientious," Perbrite said, warmly. "And after Mr. Briggs collected his parcel, did anyone else inquire about his mail?" Miss Rowley looked pleased to be consulted. Why, yes, as a matter of fact, Mrs. Copley asked the following afternoon if he'd left anything for her. Said it was a mix-up with plant instructions. I told her we don't hand over private posts. She didn't like that. Love exchanged a quick glance with Purbright. She might have known he'd received something worth retrieving. "Possibly," Purbright said, "or possibly she simply enjoys being involved." They left the post office, crossing the market square where the remnants of the Fête still lingered. A sagging banner, a patch of trampled grass, a wasp trapped in a lemonade bottle. The town was returning to normality with the weary efficiency of people used to polishing away scandal. Perbrite halted outside the tea shop on the corner. Through the window sat Mrs. Copley herself, veiled hat in place, stirring tea with brisk authority. Opposite her was another woman, tall, pale, with the carefully mended appearance of recent widowhood. Perbrite recognized her as Mrs. Briggs, the gardener's estranged wife, who had left him 3 years earlier for reasons whispered but never printed. He turned to Love. "Well now, I think a little refreshment might be instructive." They entered quietly. The bell gave its polite tinkle, and Mrs. Copley looked up with the faintly startled expression of someone caught mid-alibi. Perbrite tipped his hat. "Good morning, Mrs. Copley, Mrs. Briggs. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Mrs. Copley said, her voice cool as porcelain. "Inspector, you seem to appear wherever there's tea to be had." "It's a professional hazard," he said mildly. "We were just making inquiries about your gardener. Routine matters, of course." Mrs. Briggs's hands fluttered to her cup. "I heard about Bert. Terrible thing. He wasn't a bad man, you know, not really. Just restless." Perbrite inclined his head sympathetically. "You'd been separated for some time, I believe." 3 years. He wrote now and again, said he was keeping busy. Sometimes he'd send me money. I didn't ask from where." Mrs. Copley gave a small brittle laugh. "Bert was industrious, Inspector. My roses owe him a good deal." Perbrite studied her for a moment. "Your entries were quite remarkable, Mrs. Copley. I imagine Mr. Briggs took special care of them." "He did," she said. "He was particular about his mixtures, though, always fiddling with new concoctions. Would he have mentioned obtaining anything from a chemist or the post?" Her eyes flickered. "If he did, I took no notice. Gardeners have their secrets. I merely supplied the wages." "Of course," Perbrite said, and turned to Mrs. Briggs. "Did your husband have any medical troubles?" "Only his nerves," she said quietly. "Couldn't sleep sometimes. Used to say it was the soil talking to him. He'd take something to calm down, little drops from a bottle." "Ah," Perbrite murmured. "And the bottle did you ever see?" She shook her head. He kept it locked away. Love looked uneasy. "Sounds like he was dosing himself with something dangerous." Perbrite rose from the table, his expression mild, but his eyes faintly alert. "Gentlemen of the soil often believe a tincture will improve both plant and man, Sergeant." "Sometimes it improves neither." Mrs. Copley lifted her chin. "I suppose you'll be visiting me again?" "Inevitably," Perbrite said with a smile. "Flaxborough is too small to avoid repetition." As they stepped back into the street, Love exhaled. "She's hiding something, sir." "Of course she is," Perbrite replied, tucking his hands behind his back. "In Flaxborough, truth is usually kept in jars with tight lids. The trick is finding who forgot to seal theirs properly." They walked on, the quiet murmur of the town folding around them, shop doors closing, a milk cart rattling, the faint toll of church bells. Somewhere among those ordinary sounds, Perbrite felt, a deliberate deception was humming just out of earshot, waiting for him to tune in. The next morning, Flaxborough returned to its weekday habits with the obedient rhythm of a town that preferred its scandals neatly folded away. The fete was already being spoken of in the past tense, and Mrs. Harbottle had announced to the Women's Guild that the unfortunate incident would not discourage next year's planning, though, she added. Perhaps without dahlias. Inspector Purbright, however, remained quietly unconvinced that the matter could be so quickly pruned. At 10 o'clock he was standing once again before Mrs. Copley's tall iron gates, their gilt finials glinting in the weak sun like trophies of municipal propriety. He had chosen the time deliberately. Respectable widows were most off guard before their second cup of coffee. A maid, nervous and pink-faced, admitted him into a conservatory that smelled of damp earth and superiority. Mrs. Copley was already there, wearing gardening gloves and a hat that suggested both mourning and horticultural authority. "Inspector Purbright," she said coolly, "have you come to see the crime scene, or to inquire after my begonias?" "Merely continuing our conversation," he replied. "I find gardens often yield more than their owners intend." She gestured with her trowel toward a row of potted ferns. "You'll find nothing incriminating among my geraniums." "That would be a relief," said Perbrite mildly, stepping closer to a small wooden bench where several bottles and jars stood arranged with the precision of a chemist's shelf. One label caught his eye. "Nutrient solution, dilute before use." Another bore no label at all, merely a faint ring of residue around its neck. "Do you mix these yourself, Mrs. Copley?" "Sometimes." Mr. Briggs usually did. He was very particular about his formulas. Did he keep them here? She hesitated only for a moment. "Yes, he said plants needed consistency. I allowed him the use of this space." It was part of his wage arrangement. Purbright lifted the unmarked bottle, tilting it toward the light. Inside, a few drops of amber liquid clung to the glass. Consistency indeed. This doesn't resemble any nutrient I know. I wouldn't know either, she said quickly. It could be liniment. He was always rubbing something on his wrists. Was he? Pain in the joints? I couldn't say. I didn't pry into his health. Perbrite replaced the bottle and looked about the room again. The greenhouse was immaculate, too immaculate. Every pot was aligned as though inspected by the town surveyor. Only near the far wall did something seem slightly out of order, a small tray of soil samples, each tagged with a date, except for one that bore no tag at all. "Did Mr. Briggs keep notes on his mixtures?" he asked. "In his notebook, yes. You've probably seen it." "I have. A meticulous man." Mrs. Copley's expression softened slightly. He was, for all his faults. He had pride in his work. He didn't deserve well whatever happened. Perbrite inclined his head. Quiet. Death seldom consults merit. The maid reappeared carrying a tray with tea and promptly dropped a spoon. It clattered against the tiles, and in bending to retrieve it she revealed a small paper packet that had slipped from her apron pocket. Perbrite bent faster, handing it back with an easy smile. "Plant food, sir," the girl said, flustered. "Mrs. Copley asked me to fetch it from the chemist." Perbrite looked mildly surprised. "Today?" "Yes, sir. Said the dahlias were to have special attention." Mrs. Copley interjected with faint irritation. "A simple purchase, Inspector. Surely even the police approve of proper feeding." "Undoubtedly," said Perbrite, watching her face. "Though I do wonder, after Mr. Briggs's unfortunate experiment, do you still trust his recipes?" Her lips thinned. "If I stopped trusting every man who disappointed me, Inspector, my garden would be entirely barren." That remark hung in the air long enough to acquire meaning. Perbrite took his leave soon after, promising not to disturb her again, though both of them knew he would. Outside, Sergeant Love was waiting by the gate, a notebook in hand and an expression of eager futility. "Anything new, sir?" "Plenty of old things pretending to be new," Purbright replied. "We'll send that unmarked bottle for analysis. But before that, let's visit the chemist again. Mrs. Copley's maid just bought another packet of plant food. I'd like to know what sort of nourishment Flaxborough is dealing in." At the chemist's, Mr. Tegg was polishing the scales with a devotion bordering on romance. When Perbrite produced the paper packet, Tegg squinted at it and frowned. "Not one of mine, Inspector. Wrong type of paper, see? We use cream stock, not grey. This came from somewhere cheaper, possibly that shop out by the railway." "The hardware place?" Love asked. Tegg nodded. "They sell all sorts. Fertilizer, spirits, weed killer. Sometimes to people who shouldn't be trusted with soap." An hour later, they reached the small ironmongery near the railway line. Its proprietor, Mr. Judd, was a wiry man with a tobacco cough and the suspicious air of someone perpetually asking about licenses. When Perbrite showed him the packet, Judd gave a small grunt. "Sold a few of those last week. Weed control powder, strong stuff. Told folk to be careful who bought them. Hard to recall, Inspector. I think your gardener fellow did Briggs. Maybe that fancy widow too. Came in asking for something that'd keep rabbits off her beds. Paid cash." Perbright's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the two of them, did they ever come together?" Judd laughed dryly. "Not together, no, but close enough. She came in not 10 minutes after he left. I thought maybe they were in league over something. Not my business, though." Back at the station, Perbrite sat behind his desk, examining the bottle retrieved from the greenhouse. The liquid caught the light with a faint shimmer that reminded him unpleasantly of varnish. "If this is poison," he said, "it's a patient one, used in small doses perhaps. Gradual." Love shifted uneasily. "You think he was dosing himself, sir, or being dosed?" Perbrite murmured. In Flaxborough, people rarely kill in haste. They do it by routine, preferably just before tea. He set the bottle aside and lit his pipe. The smoke curled upward like a question mark. There's a connection between those purchases, Sergeant. Briggs, Mrs. Copley, and perhaps that advertisement for medical supplies. But what interests me more is the timing. Each seems to have acted in awareness of the other. Love frowned. You mean she knew what he was buying and he knew she'd find out? Precisely. The dance of suspicion often begins long before the music starts. Outside the window, the bells of St. Botolph's struck 12. Perbrite tapped ash into a tray and looked thoughtfully at the unmarked bottle. We'll wait for the lab's report, but meanwhile, have a discreet word with the maid, find out how long she's been in Mrs. Copley's service and whether she's paid for her loyalty in coin or comfort. I suspect she's seen more than she's told. Love nodded and left, the door closing softly behind him. Purbright leaned back in his chair, letting the town's quiet settle like dust. Somewhere amid its hedges and habits, deceit was flowering unseen, and he meant to find the root before it spread any further. By early evening, the quiet dignity of the Flaxborough police station was interrupted by the faint click of Sergeant Love's typewriter and the even fainter sound of Inspector Purbright's pipe being tamped. Outside, the street lamps glowed through a light mist, turning the town's familiar outlines into something slightly conspiratorial. The laboratory report on the unmarked bottle had not yet arrived, but Perbrite was not one to waste the interval between facts. He believed strongly that patience was the cheapest form of investigation. Love entered with a hesitant knock. "I've been to see the maid, sir. My name's Elsie Trent. Works for Mrs. Copley 3 mornings a week and occasionally evenings when there's company. Lives with her mother in Church Row." "Ah," Perbrite said, "Church Row, where virtue lives next door to curiosity." "What did she tell you?" "She was nervous, sir, but not frightened. Said Mrs. Copley's been in a strange mood since the fête. Keeps locking the conservatory at night, which she never used to. And, well, there's something else." He opened his notebook and consulted a line. "She says Mr. Briggs used to come round even on his days off, often after dark." Perbrite regarded him steadily. "That's interesting. Did she say why?" "She thinks they were quarrelling, heard voices once, couldn't make out the words, but said Mrs. Copley sounded angry, like she was accusing him of something. And the next day she found one of the dahlia pots smashed." "Accidents," Perbrite said softly, "often have better memories than witnesses." He gestured toward the chair opposite. "Go on, Sergeant." "Well," Love continued, "Elsie said she's been asked to burn some papers lately. Old receipts, she thought. But one had a bit of writing left on it that looked like an address. P.O. Box 37, Perbrite's eyebrows rose. "Our discreet medical supplier again. Yes, sir. Elsie said Mrs. Copley seemed anxious to see them gone. She didn't tell anyone, thought it wasn't her place." "Conscientious silence," Perbrite mused. "A local specialty. Did she happen to keep the ashes?" Love blinked. "I didn't think to ask. Never mind. Ask tomorrow, gently. She's the sort to feel virtuous about obedience, but flattered by attention." He leaned back in his chair, tapping the stem of his pipe against a blotter already scarred by years of deduction. "It seems our widow and our gardener were linked by more than horticultural enthusiasm. The question is whether that link was romantic, criminal, or both." Love frowned thoughtfully. If they were quarrelling, maybe she found out he was blackmailing her. Possibly. But blackmail requires both guilt and courage, and Briggs appears to have possessed only one of those in limited quantities. Still, he may have stumbled upon something worth his silence. At that moment, the telephone rang a noise, so seldom heard in Purbright's office that it startled both men. Perbrite lifted the receiver with the composure of a man answering a polite invitation to trouble. "Perbrite here?" "Yes, I see. Thank you, Doctor." He replaced the receiver carefully. "The post-mortem's in. Morphine, in small but increasing doses, administered over several days, perhaps weeks." Love let out a low whistle. "So he was poisoned, slowly." "So it seems, enough to kill him gently. No injection marks other than the one found at the Fête, so the final dose must have been taken orally or concealed in something he trusted. Food? Tea, perhaps, or something he'd been told was medicine. I suspect the good Mr. Briggs was persuaded that a dose meant to soothe him would, in time, do rather more." Perbrite rose, gathering his hat. "Let's pay a call on Mrs. Briggs." A widow may not grieve for her husband, but she seldom forgets his habits. They found Mrs. Briggs in her narrow parlour, a gas fire flickering beneath a framed sampler that read, "Home is where the hearth behaves itself." She looked surprised but not displeased to see them, though her hands trembled as she poured tea. "I didn't think you'd bother with me again," she said. "There's nothing I can tell you that'll bring him back." "Probably not," Perbrite said gently. "But perhaps you can help us understand what sort of man he was when alive. Did he ever mention being ill or taking medicine for his nerves?" She hesitated. "Sometimes he said he couldn't sleep, took drops from a little brown bottle, said Mrs. Copley gave it to him. 'Her remedy,' he called it, said it stopped his hands shaking." Perbrite's eyes flickered toward Love, then back to her. "You saw this bottle?" "Once. It smelled bitter, like almonds and vinegar mixed." Perbrite nodded slowly. "Did he seem different after using it?" "Tired sometimes, forgetful. He'd come to see me and not remember why. I thought it was a drink, but he hardly touched the stuff. When they left the cottage, the evening had deepened into fog, the kind that muffled footsteps and invited reflection. Love walked in silence for several yards before speaking. "So she was dosing him all along?" "It appears so," Perbrite said, "though we mustn't assume malice before motive. There's still the matter of what he was meant to do or not do for her. People rarely poison without reason. It's too inconvenient." Back at the station, a telegram awaited them, short, official and satisfying. The laboratory confirmed traces of morphine in the liquid from the greenhouse bottle, enough, when diluted, to provide a slow and unremarkable decline. Purbright sat at his desk, reading it twice. "Well, Sergeant, we have our poison. All that remains is to determine whose garden it truly flourished in." He looked toward the dark window, where the reflection of the office lamp floated like a small private sun. "Tomorrow we'll speak to the vicar. He often officiates at charity committees. If anyone knows who owes favours to whom in this town, it's he." Love grinned faintly. "You think the church keeps score?" "Not on paper," Perbrite said, extinguishing his pipe, "but very carefully all the same." Outside, the church clock struck 9, each note falling through the mist like a patient reminder that virtue in Flaxborough was mostly a matter of timing, and Inspector Purbright, as he closed his notebook for the night, felt that the hour for confession was drawing near. Inspector Purbright always approached the clergy with respectful caution, aware that piety could be a convenient disguise for gossip. The Reverend Copping of St. Botolph's was no exception. A man of gentle habits and inconvenient memory, he greeted the inspector at the vicarage door with the mild surprise of one who found real-life police work disappointingly similar to parish committees. "Inspector Purbright, how unusual. I trust this isn't about the missing offertory box again?" "Not today," Reverend Purbright said pleasantly. I've come to ask about Mr. Briggs the gardener, who passed away rather suddenly. You presided over the Fête committee, I believe." "Oh, quite," said Copping, ushering him inside. "Such a tragedy, though. I told Mrs. Harbottle that perhaps we might consider dahlias unsuitable for competition in future. Too much emotion involved." Purbright's gaze drifted over the vicarage drawing-room rows of hymn books, faint scent of beeswax, and an enormous fern threatening to smother a framed photograph of the Fête. "You knew Mr. Briggs personally?" "Only in passing. He tended the churchyard occasionally, assisting with our rose beds. A diligent man, though, I believe. Somewhat troubled." "In what sense?" The vicar hesitated. "He once mentioned being blackmailed, poor fellow. Said someone was threatening to ruin him. I advised prayer and patience. I assumed it was a matter of conscience." Purbright's eyebrows rose. "Did he say by whom?" "No, but he seemed frightened. I remember he came to me not long ago with an envelope that said it contained proof of some wrongdoing by a lady of the town. Asked if I would keep it safe in case anything happened to him." "And did you?" Copping coloured faintly, for a time. "But he came back 2 days later and demanded it be returned. I obliged, naturally." Perbrite studied him. "You didn't read the contents?" "My dear Inspector," the vicar exclaimed, then paused guiltily. "Well, perhaps I glanced. Only enough to see it was a letter typed, unsigned, but referring to a sum of money and something about a treatment." "Treatment?" "Yes." That word struck me. I assumed medical, perhaps some quack remedy. "You know how people are about tonics." "Indeed," Perbrite murmured. "And after he took it back, I saw him at the Fête, looking quite pale. I thought he'd been drinking lemonade too fast. Had I known?" Perbrite thanked him and took his leave, noting the way the vicar's eyes followed him anxiously to the door, as if uncertain which sin he might have confessed to himself. Outside, Sergeant Love was waiting by the church gate, gazing disapprovingly at a stone angel with a missing nose. "Find anything, sir?" A vicar with an inconvenient conscience. Briggs was being blackmailed, or believed he was. He left evidence with Copping, then reclaimed it just before his death. Love frowned. "So Mrs. Copley could have been the blackmailer?" "Or the victim," Perbrite said. "We mustn't rush to depravity when embarrassment will do." They walked back toward the square, the mist thickening like unspoken speculation. As they passed the post office, Miss Rowley waved them down from inside with the eagerness of one who smelled useful news. "Inspector," she said breathlessly, "I thought you'd want to know someone came asking again about Mr. Briggs's postbox this morning." Purbright's tone sharpened. "Who?" "Mrs. Harbottle, of all people, said she was inquiring on behalf of the Fête committee, wanted to know if there were any bills outstanding. I told her, quite firmly, that we don't discuss private mail." She seemed rather flustered. Purbright smiled faintly. "Mrs. Harbottle flustered? That's a promising development." They continued to the station, where a telegram awaited him, short, official, and wholly satisfying. The chemist's analysis of the residue from Mrs. Copley's unmarked bottle confirmed morphine in liquid suspension. Not enough for accidental overdose, more than enough for deliberate dosing. Perbrite placed the slip carefully on his desk. "We now know how he died, Sergeant. What we lack is why and for whom." Love leaned forward. "You think the letter the vicar mentioned could be tied to that?" "Blackmail." "Almost certainly, but the timing puzzles me. If Briggs was blackmailing Mrs. Copley, why would she poison him slowly? That risks discovery. And if she were paying him off, why provoke suspicion with that needle in her flower? Could someone else have planted it, sir?" "Quite possibly. Someone who wanted to ensure the scandal didn't stay buried." He reached for his pipe but paused before lighting it. "We'll need to look beyond our two widows. There's a third hand in this business, someone aware of both the money and the morphine. That afternoon, Purbright returned to the Fête grounds, now deserted except for a few withered stems and a council worker dismantling bunting. Near the spot where Briggs's body had been found, he noticed a flattened patch of grass and something glinting faintly beside it. He stooped and picked up a small cufflink, silver, engraved with an ornate H. Later that evening, he called on Mrs. Harbottle at her residence on Bracken Terrace, where she was presiding over a table of correspondence and indignation. "Inspector Perbrite," she said briskly, "if this is about the Fête, I've already written a report." "Then I'm certain it will be enlightening," Perbrite replied. "I'm more concerned with your visit to the post office." Her eyes narrowed. "Ah, Miss Rowley has been talking." "I merely wish to settle Mr. Briggs's account for supplies ordered in the committee's name. It's all perfectly proper." "I see. And might this account have involved medical goods?" "Certainly not," she said a little too quickly. "I've never ordered such things." Perbrite placed the cufflink on her table. "Would this belong to your husband by any chance?" She stared at it, colour draining from her face. "Where did you find that?" "Near the shed where Mr. Briggs died." "Curiously, it doesn't seem like a gardener's accessory." She drew a sharp breath. "My husband hasn't worn those in years. He lost one at the Fête, I expect." "Unfortunate coincidence," Perbrite said mildly. "Was he acquainted with Mr. Briggs?" She hesitated. "He may have been. My husband handles the accounts for several local societies. Mr. Briggs did odd work for some of them." Perbrite pocketed the cufflink. "Then perhaps I should have a word with him." When he left, Mrs. Harbottle remained frozen in her chair, staring at the empty space where the cufflink had been. Through the window, Perbrite saw the curtain tremble as if she were watching him leave. Back at the station, Love looked up eagerly. "Well, sir?" Perbrite removed his hat. "The vicar keeps secrets badly, the widow keeps them too well, and Mrs. Harbottle's husband appears to have lost one altogether. Tomorrow we'll speak to Mr. Harbottle. I have an idea that our tidy garden of suspects has just sprouted a new variety." He smiled faintly, lighting his pipe at last. "And, if I'm not mistaken, it may be the one that smells the most guilty." The following morning brought with it a stubborn drizzle and an even more stubborn mood in Flaxborough. It was the kind of weather that seemed to approve of secrets, softening footsteps and muting conversations. Inspector Purbright, arriving at the station, damp but unruffled, found Sergeant Love already waiting with 2 cups of tea and the morning's newspaper. "Anything useful?" Purbright asked, shedding his coat. "Only that Mrs. Harbottle's name appears 3 times in the social column, sir. Once for the Fête, once for a guild luncheon, and once for something called the Civic Morality Subcommittee." "Remarkable stamina," Purbright murmured, settling behind his desk. "We mustn't underestimate a woman who can moralize in triplicate." Love smiled faintly, then opened his notebook. "I made some inquiries about Mr. Harbottle. Works as secretary of the Town Improvement Society, part-time treasurer for 2 church groups, and curiously, trustee of a small fund that pays for horticultural prizes and welfare of local amenities. Set up about 3 years ago." 3 years later, Perbrite repeated. "Around the time Mrs. Briggs left her husband." "Yes, sir. I also checked the bank, and the fund's account has seen several irregular withdrawals, always small amounts but frequent. Signed by Harbottle himself." "Where does Mr. Does Briggs fit in? His name appears on 2 of the payment records as maintenance labour." "Paid cash," Perbrite nodded slowly. "And Mrs. Copley's gardener was being paid through a civic fund managed by Mr. Harbottle. Curious arrangement for trimming dahlias." He rose, pocketing his notebook. "Let's pay a call on the Harbottle household again, but this time we'll ask for the gentleman. They found Mr. Harbottle in his study, a narrow room lined with council pamphlets, framed certificates, and the smell of stale tobacco. He was a large man whose confidence appeared to be retreating faster than his hairline. When Purbright introduced himself, Harbottle's smile was the kind that usually precedes a confession of innocence to something not yet mentioned. "Inspector. Terrible business, that poor gardener. My wife's quite distraught about the scandal." Perbrite looked about the room before replying. "I'm sure she is. The Fête was her great success after all. Tell me, Mr. Harbottle, you handle several local accounts, do you not?" "Oh, indeed. Strictly voluntary, of course. Someone has to keep the town's ledgers tidy." "Quite so. And the horticultural fund is still flourishing?" Harbottle hesitated. "I wouldn't say flourishing. Small disbursements now and then for prizes upkeep. Little odds and ends, such as payments to Mr. Briggs." The man blinked, then coughed into his hand. "Oh, that? He did some private work for me once or twice, helping with a greenhouse my wife wanted repaired. I reimbursed him through the fund. It was simpler that way." Perbrite studied him gently. Simpler, perhaps, but not exactly proper. The council might take a dim view. A faint sheen of perspiration appeared on Harbottle's forehead. "I can assure you, Inspector, there was nothing irregular, and then you won't mind showing me the account books." Harbottle's protest was swallowed by a weak smile. Of course, though they're at the office, you understand." "Of course," Perbrite said mildly. "Perhaps I'll collect them later." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. You appear to have lost a cufflink at the Fête." The Harbottle froze. "Cufflink?" Perbrite produced the small silver ornament from his pocket. "Found near the shed where Mr. Briggs died. Handsome piece. Your initials, I believe." The man's complexion shifted from grey to an unbecoming mauve. "Must have dropped it there when I was helping tidy up." "Yes, that's it. I helped move some tables." Perbrite's tone was courteous. "You were present near the body, then?" "Not exactly near, just in the vicinity." "Before or after the discovery?" Harbottle swallowed. "After, of course. My wife told me what had happened. I went to see if I could help." Perbrite smiled pleasantly as though the explanation satisfied him entirely. "You're most civic-minded, Mr. Harbottle. I hope you won't object if we verify a few details. When they left the house," Love exhaled audibly. "He's lying, sir." "Yes," Perbrite said, "but the question is on whose behalf?" They walked in silence until they reached the square, where the drizzle had become a polite mist. Perbrite stopped before the tea shop where Mrs. Copley often took her mornings. Through the window he could see her seated alone, gloved hands folded, eyes lowered to a cup she hadn't touched. She looked, he thought, less like a criminal and more like someone waiting for a verdict that never arrived. Later, back at the station, Love returned with the account ledgers retrieved from Harbottle's office. Perbrite examined them carefully. Between pages of neat entries, one stood out: payment for horticultural supplies, Mrs. E. Copley, $25. Next to it, in a different hand, a faint note penciled, "To settle private matters, B." Perbrite tapped the page thoughtfully. "Our gardener again?" Private matter indeed. Love frowned. Could Harbottle have been paying Briggs off? Maybe to stop him saying something? Possibly. Or paying him to do something on his behalf? Perbrite leaned back. Blackmail is an untidy affair that rarely involves just two people. There's usually someone who profits indirectly. As evening fell, Perbrite asked Love to retrieve the Fête Committee's correspondence from the town hall. While waiting, he stepped to the window, watching the faint lights of Flaxborough flicker through rain like secrets behind frosted glass. The sound of typewriters from the nearby offices had ceased, leaving only the rhythm of dripping gutters. When Love returned, his face was flushed with excitement. "Found something, sir." A letter in the committee files, unsigned, typed, mentions Mr. Briggs and a promise of discretion. Says the payment would ensure no unpleasant revelations during the fete season. Perbrite took the sheet, reading it slowly. The typeface matched that used in the vicar's description of the blackmail letter. "No address," he murmured, "but the ribbon is worn on the upper line, typical of an old machine. Possibly domestic. Could it be from Mrs. Copley's? She has a new Remington, but I suspect Mrs. Harbottle's husband does not." He folded the letter neatly. "We'll have this compared at once. If the type matches Harbottle's office machine, we'll know who was truly anxious about Briggs's silence." Love's brow furrowed. Then it wasn't Mrs. Copley who blackmailed anyone, it was Harbottle himself, or his wife. Or both, Purbright said. A marriage devoted to community service often conceals a shared hobby of quiet extortion. He glanced at the clock. "Let's call it a night, Sergeant. Tomorrow we'll verify the typewriter, and perhaps the pattern will grow less tangled." As they left the office, Purbright paused at the door and looked back at the faint lamplight spilling across the desk. "Flaxborough's gardens," he said softly, "aren't the only things kept immaculate. Its sins are pruned, watered, and displayed for prizes only no one admits which bloom is poisonous until it's too late." The following morning dawned with a brittle sort of sunlight, the kind that made Flaxborough appear honest, though only on the surface. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright's office smelled faintly of damp paper and pipe tobacco. A typewriter had been carried up from the Harbottle offices at the Town Improvement Society and now sat on his desk, its keys dusted and worn. Perbrite regarded it with the same mild patience he might give a reluctant witness. Sergeant Love appeared in the doorway carrying 2 envelopes. "Morning, sir. The constable's back from Mrs. Harbottle's house. She says her husband's taken a sudden holiday. Left last night for Scarborough. Business conference, apparently." Purbright smiled without humour. How admirably convenient. Did she look concerned? "More annoyed than worried," Love said. "Told the constable to mind his own business and shut the door in his face." "Ah, conscience disguised as irritation," Perbrite mused. "A local art form." He gestured toward the machine. "Let's see if our shy accountant left fingerprints of the literary kind." Love set down the envelopes, one marked "Committee Correspondence" and the other containing the anonymous letter. He rolled a fresh sheet into the Harbottle typewriter, then typed a few words at Purbright's instruction. The resulting letters were slightly uneven, the upper halves a perfect match to the letter found in the Fête files. Perbrite leaned back, watching the words appear. There we have it. The instrument of morality. "So Harbottle wrote the blackmail letter?" Love asked. "Almost certainly," Perbrite replied. "But whether he meant to silence Briggs or Mrs. Copley or both is still uncertain. I rather think he fancied himself a quiet arranger of affairs, profiting modestly from his knowledge, a tidy sin for a tidy man." Love flipped through his notes. "And the payments to Briggs, sir?" "They might have been hush money, or wages for something less respectable," Perbrite said. "Suppose Briggs knew of the fund's irregularities and threatened exposure. Harbottle, fearful of scandal, pays him. But then Briggs becomes bold, perhaps even careless. Mrs. Copley, meanwhile, buys the same syringes, possibly at his urging. The line between accomplice and victim grows blurred." He rose, pacing slowly. "We'll confirm Harbottle's whereabouts on the night of the fete. If he leaves early, we'll need a witness. And I think it's time to speak again with the Reverend Copping. Clergymen are excellent barometers of guilt. They always begin to perspire before anyone else notices the weather." An hour later, the vicar was found in his garden, pruning roses with the pained diligence of a man convinced that horticulture and humility were equally redemptive. When Perbrite mentioned Harbottle's name, the pruning shears froze mid-snip. "Ah, yes," Copping stammered. "He was, at the fete, of course. A great support to the committee. I recall he left quite early, though, said he was unwell. Before the discovery of Mr. Briggs's body? Yes, I believe so. Did he mention why he was unwell? Copping hesitated. He seemed flustered. Said something about an argument behind the tents. I didn't pry. Purbright regarded him steadily. But you overheard something, perhaps? The vicar looked at the rosebush as though expecting divine intervention. Raised voices only. I thought it was a domestic quarrel. Mrs. Harbottle can be firm in her opinions. Was it Mrs. Harbottle he spoke with? I'm not entirely certain, the vicar said, colouring. But I did see Mrs. Copley walking away soon after. She appeared upset. Thank you, Perbrite said, as if the man had just confirmed the weather report. You've been most helpful. As they walked back toward the station, Love said quietly, so Mrs. Copley and Harbottle had words. Could they have been arguing about Briggs? Almost certainly, Perbrite said. If Briggs threatened to expose Harbottle's misuse of funds, Mrs. Copley may have been caught in the middle, perhaps unwittingly. She had the means to administer the morphine. He had the motive to encourage it. But who planted the needle in her flower? Purbright smiled faintly. The one who wanted her blamed, of course. And who better than a man already practised in falsifying records? When they reached the station, Constable Parkin was waiting with a telegram. From Scarborough, sir. Local police found Harbottle, checked into a boarding house under his own name, asked if they'd forward his mail. It seems he's expecting a parcel. Purbright raised an eyebrow. A parcel? From where? Didn't say, sir. But the address is the same as Mrs. Copley's Elm House, Flaxborough. The inspector's expression brightened as though a dull picture had just acquired perspective. Ah, so the blackmailer still expects payment. How obliging of him to provide a forwarding address. He turned briskly to Love. Send word for Mrs. Copley to come here at once. Tell her we've discovered something among Mr. Briggs's effects that concerns her. I'd like to see how she reacts. Half an hour later, Mrs. Copley entered the office in her customary calm, though her gloved hands betrayed a faint tremor. You wish to see me, Inspector? Yes, Mrs. Copley. We've traced the letter Mr. Briggs kept hidden, the one about treatment and a certain payment. It seems the author was not a stranger to you. Her expression barely shifted, but her eyes darted once toward the typewriter on the desk. You've found who wrote it? Purbright nodded. The machine, at least. It belonged to Mr. Harbottle. She sank slightly into the chair opposite him. Harbottle. But why? That, Perbrite said gently, is what we hope you might tell us. You see, he's now in Scarborough, awaiting a parcel addressed from your home. She opened her mouth, closed it, then laughed once, softly, without mirth. He's still playing games, then. He thinks I'll pay again. Again? Perbrite prompted. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Harbottle discovered that my husband left me certain documents when he died, letters that might have embarrassed some in town. He threatened to publish them unless I contributed to the civic fund. Briggs knew about it. He handled some of the errands, collecting the payments, delivering letters. But lately he began hinting he might take over the business himself. Perbrite nodded slowly. And so both men became liabilities. Only one of them ended up dead. She flinched. I never touched him. I swear it. I only refused to pay more. I believe you, Perbrite said, but someone wanted you to appear guilty. The morphine came from your greenhouse and the syringe from Briggs's tools, both accessible to anyone familiar with the Fête grounds. Someone tidy enough to tidy up afterwards. He rose and paced toward the window. I imagine Mr. Harbottle, faced with exposure, decided to sacrifice one accomplice to frighten the other. A little poison in Briggs's tea, a planted syringe in your flower, and the town's attention neatly diverted. Mrs. Copley's voice was barely above a whisper. Can you prove that? Not yet, Perbrite said, but we soon shall. He's expecting a parcel, you see. We'll send him one. Her gaze sharpened, And what will you put in it, Inspector? Only what every guilty man deserves, he said quietly. The truth was properly addressed and politely delivered. That evening, under Purbright's supervision, a plain envelope left Flaxborough, postmarked Elm House. Inside was a single sheet typed on Harbottle's own machine. I have told the police everything. They know about the fund, the morphine, and the fete. You'd better return before they send it to you. Perbrite sealed it himself. If he's as careful as I think, he'll come running. And when he does, we'll be ready to offer him tea without sugar. Love chuckled nervously. You think he'll take the bait, sir? Purbright looked out at the darkening square, the first lamplight flickering through mist. In Flaxborough, Sergeant, guilt always comes home before supper. It has a fine sense of timing. It took only 2 days for Flaxborough's self-appointed guardian of civic propriety to return. On the Morning Post of the second day, Mrs. Harbottle telephoned the police station, her voice brittle with satisfaction. "My husband is home, Inspector," she announced. "He seems quite unwell, though I dare say that's nothing the truth couldn't cure. I should appreciate your coming before the neighbours draw conclusions." Inspector Perbrite, who never liked to deprive neighbours of their sport, but liked deceit even less, arrived half an hour later with Sergeant Love in tow. The Harbottle residence looked just as it had before tidy curtains, bright brass knocker, and the faint scent of disinfected conscience. Mr. Harbottle received them in the sitting-room, dressed in a robe that failed to disguise the disorder underneath. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself tea, though the attempt at nonchalance was spirited. "Inspector, what an unexpected pleasure. You find me recovering from a rather abrupt holiday." Perbrite smiled. "Your wife said as much. We're pleased you returned voluntarily." Harbottle's eyes flickered. "Voluntarily? You make it sound as though I fled." "You did leave rather suddenly," Perbrite observed. "Scarborough is a fine town, but it seems an odd destination for a man expecting a parcel from home." The cup rattled faintly against the saucer. "Parcel? Indeed," said Perbrite mildly. "The postmaster there was kind enough to confirm you were expecting one from Mrs. Copley's address. We were curious to know what you anticipated receiving." Harbottle attempted a laugh that collapsed into a cough. "Good heavens, Inspector, must every little misunderstanding be wrapped in suspicion? I simply asked that my correspondence be redirected. A matter of routine." "Ah," Perbrite said, "I see. So the typewritten letter found among the Fate Committee's files, the one warning of unpleasant revelations, was also routine?" Harbottle's colour drained as if the air itself had been confiscated. "I don't know what you mean." Perbrite withdrew the letter and placed it on the table. "Typed on your office machine, the same one used for civic reports, I believe." For a moment Harbottle stared at it, then gave a small, defeated sigh. "You've become very thorough, Inspector." "Yes, I wrote it. I was attempting to recover certain funds owed to the committee by threatening Mrs. Copley." "She owed the town a debt," he said hastily. "Her late husband profited from contracts arranged through me. When he died, she inherited the gains. I merely reminded her that honour demanded restitution." "Paid to a private fund you controlled," Perbrite said evenly. "And when she refused?" "I pressed harder," Harbottle admitted. "I never intended harm, only persuasion." "Did you employ Mr. Briggs for that persuasion?" "He acted as an intermediary, yes. I thought a man of his position might convey messages more discreetly. I had no idea he would exploit the situation for himself." Perbrite's expression softened, almost kindly. "So he began blackmailing you in turn?" Harbottle's jaw twitched. "He demanded more money than I could supply. Threatened to expose the entire arrangement, the fund, the withdrawals, everything. I was desperate." "Desperation can be an industrious gardener," Perbrite murmured. "It often plants the deadliest seeds." There was a pause, filled only by the ticking of a clock that seemed embarrassed by the conversation. Love shifted uncomfortably. You poisoned him, didn't you, sir? Harbottle gave a faint smile. Poison is such a melodramatic word. I gave him some medicine to calm his nerves. He complained constantly of shaking hands. The vicar prescribed nothing, so I procured a tonic from the chemist. It was harmless enough in small doses. Except you increased them, Perbrite said quietly. A little more each time until his nerves ceased to trouble him altogether. Harbottle sank back in his chair. He would have ruined me. My wife, my reputation, the committee, everything. You don't understand what scandal can do in a town like this. I think I do, Perbrite said. I also understand what cowardice can do. Harbottle's hands tightened on the armrests. And what would you have done, Inspector? Allowed a blackmailer to dictate your life? I might have tried honesty. It costs less ink. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Purbright continued, his tone soft but relentless. You planted the syringe in Mrs. Copley's dahlia, didn't you? To divert suspicion. You knew the gossip would bloom faster than any evidence. I panicked, Harbottle whispered. It seemed perfect she had motive, the equipment, even the temperament people whisper about. I thought if the police looked her way, I'd have time to, he faltered. To run, Perbrite finished. And when our letter reached you in Scarborough, you believed she'd confessed. Harbottle closed his eyes. I thought I could still salvage something, but you knew I'd come back. Perbrite rose slowly, signalling to Love. The guilty always do, Mr. Harbottle. They can't resist pruning their own reputations. Mrs. Harbottle appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. Is this necessary, Inspector? Surely a public scandal would serve no one. I'm afraid the matter has already gone public, madam, Perbrite said. It began with a fete and a flower. It ends, I hope, with a lesson in moderation. As Love led the trembling man away, she turned to Perbrite with something like gratitude behind her anger. I warned him that civic virtue makes a poor hiding place. Perhaps you'll tell the papers he died honourably. Perbrite inclined his head. I'll tell them he served his community, Mrs. Harbottle. In his own way. When they returned to the station, Love broke the long silence. Funny thing, sir, for a man obsessed with appearances, he didn't seem half as sorry as I'd expected. Perbrite lit his pipe, the smoke curling like a final punctuation. Guilt seldom weeps in public, Sergeant. It prefers to tidy up quietly like an overzealous gardener after a frost. He walked to the window, watching the drizzle resume its familiar rhythm. Flaxborough looked much the same as it always had, a neat mosaic of roofs, hedges, and gossip. Yet somewhere beneath that calm, a tremor of human folly had run its course. Send word to the vicar, Perbrite said at last. He'll want to know his prayers have been answered, if not in the way he imagined. And see that Mrs. Copley's name is cleared before the citizen finds something more entertaining. Love nodded. Yes, sir. You think the town will settle again now? Until the next moral emergency, Perbrite said dryly. In Flaxborough, tranquility is merely the pause between scandals. He extinguished his pipe and began writing his report in neat, deliberate lines, his pen scratching softly through the hush. Outside, the rain washed the market square clean for another day of ordinary respectability, while somewhere a wilted dahlia stood in its pot, its petals fading gracefully, as though keeping the town's final secret. The morning arrived bright and cold, with a wind that rattled the rain-streaked windows of Flaxborough like a hint of disapproval. Inspector Perbrite, standing in the police station, considered the final phase of his plan with the deliberate care of a gardener inspecting a delicate bed. Sergeant Love, hovering near the doorway, watched him with the impatience of a man unused to waiting, while another man thought. We need to see everyone in one place, Purbright said quietly, so that the threads unravel under their own weight. Sometimes the most effective pressure is merely polite attention. By mid-morning, the Harbottle residence resembled a small court of inquiry. Mrs. Copley, Mrs. Harbottle, and Reverend Copping sat across from Purbright, their hands folded and eyes carefully alert. Sergeant Love stood at the back, notebook at the ready, prepared to note the subtle reactions that the inspector often allowed to speak louder than words. Perbrite began with a gentle tone. "Thank you all for assembling so promptly. It is important that we understand precisely what occurred during the fête and the days leading to Mr. Briggs's unfortunate death. Let us begin with Mrs. Copley. Would you recount your movements on the day of the incident?" She did so with precision, describing her supervision of the garden entries, the delivery of fertilizer, and her observation of Mr. Briggs handling the dahlias. At intervals, Perbrite allowed a pointed silence, inviting a flicker of reaction, a hesitated glance, or a tightening of lips. When she had finished, he leaned forward. "You purchased syringes, Mrs. Copley. Did you use them yourself?" "No, Inspector," she said firmly. "I only procured them for the plants." "Any suggestion otherwise is false." He nodded. "Quiet. And yet Mr. Briggs's death involved morphine, obtained from the same place. Perhaps someone used your equipment in a manner you did not anticipate." Her face paled slightly, though she remained composed. I cannot imagine." "Indeed," Perbrite said. "Now, Reverend Copping, you were aware of a letter Mr. Briggs entrusted to you. Did you understand its contents?" Copping adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Only that it involved sums of money and possibly a disagreement between parties. I confess I did not investigate further. I kept it safely as he requested." "And returned it to him when he came back?" Perbrite asked. "Yes," Copping said. He seemed insistent. "Thank you, that will be all for now." Perbrite turned his attention to Mrs. Harbottle. "Madam, your husband controls a fund that has been used for horticultural payments. Some of these payments were made to Mr. Briggs. Could you clarify their purpose?" Mrs. Harbottle's hands twitched in her lap. "They were legitimate," she said firmly. "The fund is for prizes and maintenance. Any other use would be extraordinary." Perbrite allowed a pause, letting the air thicken. Then he leaned forward, folding his hands. Mr. Harbottle, if he were present, might wish to confirm that the letter instructing Mr. Briggs to manage the collection of funds was typed on his machine, and that these letters served both to preserve the town's order and to ensure compliance. A faint gasp echoed from Mrs. Harbottle. Mrs. Copley's eyebrows rose imperceptibly. Copping fidgeted with his watch chain. Each reaction was the sound of hidden guilt stirring. Perbrite continued softly, "We know that Mr. Briggs began to threaten disclosure of his own use of this information to obtain additional payments. In that moment, the man who orchestrated the flow of funds had a choice: admit the misappropriation or prevent exposure. He let the sentence linger. The former would have caused a scandal. The latter, well, one may persuade even the most obstinate intermediary to take medicine that calms nerves gradually." Mrs. Harbottle's face tightened. "You mean—" "Yes," Perbrite said gently. "Morphine, administered in small doses over days, enough to stop the interference without overt violence. The needle in Mrs. Copley's flower, a gesture designed to shift suspicion. The public sees a suspicious widow. The private manipulator remains hidden." Copping cleared his throat. "Surely, Inspector, that is speculation." "Only until I produce confirmation," Perbrite said, "which I am pleased to say has now been achieved. We have the laboratory reports, the typewriter comparison, and the documented payments. All corroborate the scenario that I have outlined." Mrs. Harbottle's voice trembled slightly. "But my husband Purbright," inclined his head. Mr. Harbottle acted in fear of exposure. He underestimated the vigilance of those around him. His attempt to disguise his misdeeds as civic duty led to Mr. Briggs's demise, and the carefully planted evidence misdirected suspicion to Mrs. Copley. Mrs. Copley exhaled softly. So it was him all along, not me. No, Perbrite said, not you. Merely a coincidence of circumstance. In Flaxborough, coincidences are often more dangerous than malice. He rose and faced them each in turn. The truth has been uncovered politely, without sensationalism. It is sometimes remarkable how effective civility can be in revealing the guilty. Mr. Harbottle will answer for his actions through the appropriate channels, but the town may rest assured that the widow and the vicar need no censure. A long silence followed, broken only by the soft ticking of a mantel clock. Each participant seemed to absorb the weight of the revelation, the subtle tremor of their own complicity in the social dance of Flaxborough. Finally, Mrs. Harbottle spoke. "Inspector, you have managed this with discretion. Perhaps the town will forgive him, and perhaps in time us all." Purbright smiled faintly. "The town will judge as it always does, madam, but in my experience it is rare for guilt to go unrecorded, and rarer still for it to repeat so quietly." He gestured to Love. "Sergeant, I believe our work here is concluded. Let us leave the town to its routines. The garden, the fete, and the gossip will resume in their own time." As they departed, the sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the market square with a gentle brilliance. The town appeared normal once more, though the inspector knew better. Beneath the polite facades and trimmed hedges, human nature persisted, intricate and unyielding. Perbrite paused at the station door, surveying the familiar streets. "Tomorrow," he said softly to Love, "we return to paperwork. But today we have pruned a particularly insidious bloom, and that, Sergeant, is sufficient accomplishment in any garden." Love nodded, notebook closed. "Yes, sir, very sufficient indeed." By mid-afternoon the Harbottle residence was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of servants attending to routine tasks. Inspector Perbrite had summoned all principal parties to the drawing-room once again, not for recrimination, but for clarity. The room smelled faintly of polished wood, and lingering tea a neutral stage for the exposition of human folly. Mrs. Copley sat with her gloves folded neatly on her lap, her expression composed, though alert. Reverend Copping, ever the emblem of pastoral concern, fidgeted with a handkerchief, while Mrs. Harbottle adjusted a lace cuff, as though ensuring her dignity might withstand what was to come. Sergeant Love lingered by the door, notebook in hand, recording every subtle movement, every telling glance. Perbrite began gently, his voice steady and measured. "We are here to reconcile the events surrounding Mr. Briggs's unfortunate death at the Garden Fete. Each of you has provided essential information, and I thank you. Now we shall understand the entire sequence, so that the truth may rest plainly among us." He paused, allowing his gaze to settle first on Mrs. Copley. "Your involvement, madam, was purely horticultural. You purchased the syringes and equipment for the garden. You did not administer any medication to Mr. Briggs yourself, though your greenhouse provided the convenient setting." Mrs. Copley inclined her head slightly. "Yes, Inspector, that is correct. Very good," he said, turning toward the vicar. "Reverend Copping, you kept a letter entrusted to you by Mr. Briggs. Its contents hinted at payments and certain warnings. You returned it when he requested, without interference beyond careful storage." "Indeed," said the vicar, bowing his head. "I only acted as a custodian." "Excellent. Now we come to the core of the matter." Perbrite's eyes shifted to Mrs. and Mr. Harbottle. It is clear that Mr. Harbottle, fearing exposure of irregular payments through the horticultural fund, devised a method to neutralize the potential threat posed by Mr. Briggs. Mr. Briggs, perceiving opportunity, may have hinted at blackmail, seeking to exploit knowledge of the fund and related letters. Mrs. Harbottle gasped softly, covering her mouth. Harbottle himself swallowed hard, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Faced with this risk, Mr. Harbottle administered morphine, gradually, to Mr. Briggs, enough to stop interference without immediate detection. The needle placed in Mrs. Copley's dahlia was a deliberate misdirection, designed to shift suspicion to her, as she was nearest and most accessible, and had purchased syringes. The intention was never to harm her, but to protect appearances and divert inquiry. Harbottle's voice trembled. I only wanted to protect the fund, to prevent scandal. I never intended death. Perbrite inclined his head. Your intentions do not alter the outcome. The act was deliberate, though methodical. In Flaxborough, one rarely kills impulsively. Prudence is exercised, even in wrongdoing. He paused, surveying the assembled faces. The payments traced in the fund, the letters typed on the Harbottle office machine, the morphine found in the greenhouse, and the lab analysis of the liquid all converge on a single narrative. Mr. Briggs's demise was the result of carefully considered action, prompted by fear and the desire to control circumstance. Mrs. Copley exhaled, relief mingling with residual apprehension. So I am not at fault. Not in this matter, madam. The fault lies, where it occurred, within Mr. Harbottle's miscalculations. Perbrite's tone was mild but firm, a teacher delivering final lessons, and his wife, while aware of funds and letters, did not engage in active intervention. Your presence has been one of propriety throughout. Reverend Copping cleared his throat. Inspector, is the matter now concluded? Will justice be served? Yes, Perbrite said. Mr. Harbottle will answer to the proper authorities. The town may continue, though with lessons learned in discretion, responsibility, and the hazards of excessive order. Flaxborough thrives on civility, but even civility must reckon with human nature. He glanced at Sergeant Love. And that, Sergeant, is why a patient investigation, guided by observation and restraint, often succeeds where haste would fail. Love made a note, nodding solemnly. Understood, sir. Perbrite allowed the quiet to settle. The room, once thick with tension, now felt cleared by the simple act of revelation. He walked to the window, looking out over the square where shopkeepers moved in predictable rhythm and children played among the faint remnants of the fête. The bunting had been packed away, the flowers trimmed, yet the memory lingered like a careful fragrance. Time passes, Sergeant Perbrite said softly. The town will resume its routines, but subtle changes remain, suspicion less easily entertained, gossip measured with caution, and the knowledge that even the smallest act can have considerable consequence. Mrs. Harbottle exhaled and straightened her posture. I suppose we must all be more careful in future. Indeed, Perbrite replied. Flaxborough requires vigilance, but also patience, understanding, and occasionally quiet forgiveness. With the room now reconciled, he gestured toward the door. We shall leave you to your affairs. And, Sergeant, we return to our paperwork, where evidence waits patiently for analysis and reflection. Outside, the town carried on with the ordinary hum of commerce and civility. The church bells tolled, the market square bustled with the usual cadence, and the garden plots bore the promise of new blooms. Yet beneath the surface, a small lesson had been taught. Appearances, however neat, often conceal the most intricate human manoeuvres, and truth, like a well-tended garden, reveals itself only in due time. Perbrite and Love stepped onto the street, the air crisp and clear after a light shower. The inspector paused, glancing back at the Harbottle residence. Sergeant, the case is concluded. The guilty have been identified, the innocent cleared, and the town may sleep more quietly tonight. Love exhaled, smiling faintly. "Well done, sir. Flaxborough's mysteries never cease to amaze." Perbrite gave a small reflective nod. "Nor do its people. Let us hope this lesson in discretion and prudence remains, at least until the next fête." He adjusted his hat and walked toward the station, leaving behind a town restored to outward calm. In the distance, the gentle rustle of leaves, the faint scent of damp earth, and the echo of a brass band's tune that had survived the fête reminded him that Flaxborough's charm lay not only in its gardens and civility, but in the quiet persistence of human nature, faults, follies, and all. Sergeant Love followed, noting the contented murmur of the town. Purbright's voice, soft and dry, carried over the steps. "In the end, it is civility, patience, and observation that prune the weeds from human conduct. And that, Sergeant, is the finest sort of detective work there is."